Okay, so I'm going to try to pick up where I left off. I am sorry for the interruptions yesterday. Sorry for whatever phone calls might try to come in today. It is more than a little challenging sometimes. So yesterday we left off with dealing with a couple of issues. One of the first ones was we're looking at different states and cities where they say they have standards, they say they have law enforcement, they say that they are trying to do what is right for everybody. And yet at the same time, what we're finding out is that no, in fact, they don't seem to have any standard at all. In fact, any standards that they claim to have, they're just not enforcing. And that just really isn't okay. Now, what do you do when you're in a situation where there seems to be an agreement that there's a standard, but there's not really an agreement on its enforcement, that it is selective in who that standard is enforced on? When you have any type of a situation where there is selective standards rather than a standard for all, what you have done is actually create a bias. Not only have you created a bias, in some cases, you actually created bigotry. Now, historically, we've identified that this kind of an approach is really not helpful. We've used it, sadly, on situations where individuals who, just because they had a different color skin, laws were applied differently to them than they were to anybody else. This is abhorrent, to say the least. One of the other things we try to identify is, well, what do we do in those situations? I mentioned yesterday the movie V for Vendetta, where it highlights where things have been taken to a next level of extreme. Now, this next level extreme is something that makes me incredibly uncomfortable, because this is a situation where you can't say safely that, again, standards won't be enforced selectively. Wherever you have mankind, you have bias. Wherever you have individuals who have different backgrounds than you, different skin colors than you, different eye color, hair color, whatever, people will find a way to make it be different. And their bias, their presuppositions are going to gear them in a particular direction. People from a different culture bring in a totally different standard and also an enforcement model. Friend of mine from Nigeria highlighted for me, and no, he's not some strange Nigerian prince who's delivered that $1 million that I emailed him about. Instead, he's an individual who happens to be a Christian down there, and identified that one of the challenges for them is that the laws are enforced so differently and so selectively that it's almost guaranteed that if you're a Christian in Nigeria, especially certain parts of Nigeria, you may find that your entire village will be slaughtered simply because you're not Muslim. Now, Boko Haram is one of the individual groups that are down there that is enforcing their ideas of what the standards should be. This makes me incredibly uncomfortable. I never want to see this sort of thing come here. However, I'm challenged on a personal level where you have places like Portland that are so close, where you have individuals that are throughout the night destroying federal property. They're saying F the police. They're doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and no one is enforcing the laws. No one is holding them accountable. This kind of thing just kind of drives me nuts, because it's one of those deals like, what do you do in that situation? Well, it's difficult. And one of the things that I put out there is it's going to be a journal requirement, is what do you do? As we come into Christmas time, one of the things that we try to talk about is what or who was this guy named Jesus? What or who was this person named by his Hebrew name, Jeshua ben Judah, meaning Joshua, the son of the lineage of Judah? What do we do? What do we do in that situation? Well, with Yeshua, we have identified a standard. One of the key things about a monotheistic faith that was given to us out of the Old Testament is a standard. It's called the Ten Commandments. It's one of those ideas that, hey, here are morality rules and absolute standards that pretty much every society, if they follow, will have a right and just society. Now, that may seem just counterintuitive to a lot of our postmodern friends who believe that in this world there are no such things as real absolute standards. In those situations, it's one of those that it's really not that difficult to help them sway or swing this way. All you have to do is violate their perceived rights, and all of a sudden they're totally on board with the idea of absolute standards. A friend of mine, we talked about it, and he was definitely a moral relativist. He was definitely a hedonist and somebody who absolutely wanted to get engaged in what he was doing. I said, hey, can I borrow $20? And he said, sure. So he handed me the $20. I said, see you later. He's like, when are you going to pay me back? I said, never. He highlighted that that would be theft. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't believe in standards. He stood at me and stared. And in that moment, he realized that, in fact, he did have standards. He did have rules that he wanted to follow and wanted to believe in. So in that kind of a situation, it creates all kinds of cognitive dissonance where you want to say one thing and go down the road of believing the other. One of the examples of that from the modern time periods are those individuals who tell me that evolution absolutely is true. Evolution has to be believed in. Evolution is the standard. The science is settled. Well, in that kind of a situation, one of the things that I have to bring forward and put out there is, yeah, but then why are we saving the whales? I mean, this is one of those situations where if we're believing in evolution, I'm at the top of the food chain. If I can eat you, you don't deserve to stick around. Why do we have an endangered species list? If we believe in evolution, why do we care about medicine? Why are we trying to save anybody? It should be based on survival of the fittest. This is something that often runs a lot of these individuals into a head-crushing wall moment where they identify that, oh my gosh, maybe we do and should have standards. That's a bit of a challenge, really. Now, C.S. Lewis says, man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. Seems like a pretty simple idea, but it's one of those things that most of society has identified, hey, there are certain things that in the Western world we think are wrong. Now, there are certain other cultures that they have different rules, different standards. When I was over in Kazakhstan, as an example, and some of the other stands where they have a Russian culture built into them, it's totally normal to bribe somebody in order to get something done. I used to think that was something that didn't apply here in the American world until things occurred in recent elections. And so this is one of those things where I'm just like, wait, what's going on here? To me, that's wrong. To me, that's not right. To me, that's one of those situations where we have to say, okay, if things are not right, then what are we basing those standards on? The people in Portland have said, hey, here are the rules, but they're not enforcing them. So what do we do about that? They're all more concerned about saying, well, they deserve their freedom of speech. That's great. Well, they all deserve to assemble and shout out what their issues are. Also, great. But our Constitution says peaceably assemble. Our Constitution also points out that it's not okay to destroy other people's stuff. In fact, we wrote all these laws to say that it's not okay to destroy other people's stuff. And so what I would argue is that in this scenario with these individuals, they know what the standard is. They're just not comfortable enforcing it. They're not comfortable with dealing with, confronting the idea that in this situation, there are rules that have to be enforced. They don't want to be the bad guy. They don't want to be the person that's the heavy. It scares them. It frightens them to hold other people to a standard or to some kind of a absolute concept. Now, there's a distinction between the source of an objective moral value and the duties and how we come to know them. The first is called ontological, where we kind of question the source and the origin. The second is epistemological, which means knowledge, right? We've talked about these big words before. So we can either see that the source of these things is either the universe as a whole, society or culture, the individual, or some kind of transcendent creator. So we're going to have to examine the options. So if we say, a man said to the universe, sir, I exist. Nevertheless, replied the universe, the fact has not created in me the slightest feeling of obligation. The universe as its perception of us is laughable. We are a gnat on the back end of an elephant at best. So the universe really doesn't care about us as a whole or as individuals. In fact, it's one of the social Darwinian moments and ideas that the universe goes on about its business just as it always has. Now, from a cause and effect standpoint, an effect must represent its cause in essence or nature. So how can a moral, impersonal, meaningless, purposeless universe accidentally create personal, moral beings who are obsessed with meaning and purpose? Right? So if the model of evolution, this phyletic evolutionary model, where we go from some kind of primordial oozy stuff and to some metazoan single-celled organism, and then all the way up to what you see here, which I realize is not the most perfect being, but I do have the perfect hair, I'm just saying. Once we get to this point, how do we go from all these series of accidents that supposedly led to these highly evolved individuals from something that formed and acts by accident on a daily basis, that is basically chaos? What you have down in Portland or other areas that are like this are individuals who embrace the chaos. If they are nihilistic, then they argue that nothing matters. So what they do, no one should care about. It's their business, not yours. Even if it affects you, affects your tax dollars. They don't care. It makes them feel good. Therefore, it should be okay. Humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. Life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Richard Dawkins, renowned atheist, and quite frankly, a God hater, also happens to be the son of Jews who survived the Holocaust. You have to put everything in context. You have to sit and consider, where is this person forming this opinion from? Where is it coming in at? If there's no evil and no good, why do we have rules at all? Why do we have laws at all? If we are only here for the ongoing movement of DNA from generation to generation, then why isn't everyone a totally sex-crazed individual, beyond teenagers, that is? Well, we're not. In fact, we move more and more towards the idea of having a purpose. We want to have a legacy. We want to have a reason why we are still here. Did we matter when the universe is over? Did we matter? Did we have some kind of a reason for being here as and when our time is up? It's always a question that haunts every single one of us. And as I get older, it's one that definitely stands out more and more to me. Now, Darwin deduced a theory of natural selection to explain the adaptations in which he previously had seen the handiwork of God. Now, he believed that he was committing cultural murder. He understood immediately that if natural selection explained adaptations and evolution by descent were true, then the argument from design was dead, and all that went with it. I would argue that the existence of a personal God, free will, life after death, immutable moral laws, and ultimate meaning in life would also be dead. This is something that we have to embrace, and something we have to understand, that there is a segment of our population that firmly, totally, and completely agrees with this theory. There is a segment of our population, and I was one of them, who argued into and became priests of this religion of naturalism, this religion of the idea that we are nothing but accidents, and if we are nothing but accidents, then you, sir or madam, have no right to judge me, because I can have and do whatever I like, because it is about me. It is what I want to do, what I want to enjoy, and how I want to do things. Now, ordinarily, I would say this is the raving of a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old who's like, I want the cookie, you'll give it to me now. You ever seen these individuals hold little temper tantrums? How about you as a kid? You ever throw the temper tantrum? I'll bet you did. Every single child goes through this phase, but eventually they have to grow up. If they have to grow up, all of a sudden they figure out, oh, wait, what I wanted wasn't nearly as important as what I thought that I wanted. What about from culture? In Kenya, the practice of beading is carried out. This is where a close family member takes a young girl and places strands of beads around the young girl's neck. The effect is a temporary engagement, and the relative can now have sexual relations with her. Some girls are beaded when they are 6 years old. Many young girls get pregnant and either have abortions or kill their babies at birth. When they reach adulthood, the girls will marry outside of their village, but taboo dictates the girls will never be able to marry if they keep their babies, resulting from beating. They've just justified child rape by a family member. How is this okay? Why and in what logical right mind would think that this is okay? This isn't rational. What father or family member thinks that it's okay to say, well, I should be able to abuse this young child as I want, and if they get pregnant, that child should die. So they're willing to engage in a violation of their sacred vows to protect members of their own family, to satisfy their own immoral needs, wants, and desires. And should there be a life created out of that immorality, they apply a taboo to it. They apply a stigma. They apply the idea that this child, if it keeps its child, is not worthy of being married long-term to anyone. They're justifying infanticide because of their immorality. Certain cultures, it's okay that you can burn the widow if certain situations. Cannibalism is okay in certain countries, Papua New Guinea, because it's a part of what they've always done. Unforgiveness can be morally acceptable if. Murder can be morally acceptable if. Rape can be morally acceptable if. Gratuitously torturing innocent babies can be morally acceptable if. I got to tell you, if there's ever a situation where you are answering the second half of this question with if this situation is true, you're wrong, okay? I'm going to tell you right now, the whole idea of burning some woman to her death is unacceptable. Eating a fellow human being is unacceptable. Not to mention, some individuals are just a little too grisly. Murder should never be morally acceptable. Unforgiveness does nothing to the person that's not forgiven, but it does everything to the person who is not forgiving that other person. Rape should never be morally acceptable. As a society, as men, as young men, we should always be willing to stand up and say, no, this is not okay, this is not right. But there are certain societies where they're saying that it's okay. Who are we to judge? When are we allowed to judge? During the trials at Nuremberg, the Nazis' defense attorneys argued that Hitler's soldiers were on trial, were only following orders. The judge countered that argument with the question, but sir, is there not a law above our laws? We need an ultimate authority to appeal to in matters that transcend history and culture or society. I would argue that today, one of the lessons learned out of the Nuremberg trials is that a soldier is absolutely able to question an unlawful order or an order he considers to be unlawful. It's an opportunity for him to say, hang on, wait a minute, that's not okay. What the Nazis did was brutal. What groups like Boko Haram do is brutal. It's disgusting. Just today, I read another story of over 100 Christians were killed by Boko Haram. It's not in the headlines anywhere. It's not something broadly put out there. Instead, we're focused on whether or not Joseph Biden, the wannabe president-elect, is going to get a cat, because somehow that's important news. What or who is mankind morally obligated to? Real moral obligation exists, but to whom? Sorry. We have to consider the issue of what's called the reformer's dilemma. How can a culture ever be positively influenced from the outside if the culture is the determiner of good and evil? How can we ever change or improve Portland, as an example, or even downtown Seattle and some of the chaos that goes on down there? How can we ever positively influence these people? It can never come from the outside in. And I know this and say this as someone who's been the clinical director of a drug rehab. We had horrible success rates amongst those individuals that were ordered to be there. In fact, it was nearly a 90% fail rate. The moment anytime someone is forced to do something, they're certainly not going to give their best effort, and they're only going to give you a minimal requirement of obligation. They're only going to give you their minimal investment of their time and anything else. The individuals, on the other hand, who came to us because they wanted to change. These are the individuals who saw the greatest long-term success in our longitudinal studies, upwards of 85 to 90%. And I will tell you that kind of a success rate is unheard of, even in groups like 12-step programs. In the 12-step programs, at best, you might see a 40% success rate, but that's only if there's an ongoing accountability. In the programs that I ran, we didn't see you anymore. It's because you had made a personal choice to be better and do better. How many of you have ever tried to be on a diet? How many of you have ever tried to change something about yourself that you just didn't like? How many of you had to change because someone on the outside, a parent or friend or whatever, said, you need to change? And the first thing you did was rebel against it. Sometimes we even rebel against ourselves. We know we're supposed to live differently. We know we're supposed to do something differently. We know we're not supposed to do X, Y, Z behavior. And yet, we know this because the outside world is telling us it's bad for you. It's not healthy. It's not going to be good for your mental health. Blah, blah, blah. In all of the situations, we know better, but we do it anyway. That's a personal choice. Some would argue, yes, I have an animosity towards Dutch Bros. It's because it is a sugar coma in a cup. But there are those individuals who know better. They know, okay, I shouldn't drink over 1,000 calories in a cup, but I'll have 3. My lifestyle indicates I'm only going to burn about 1,500 calories today. Therefore, I have a surplus of over 2,000 calories just in those drinks. Did I know better? Absolutely. Did I decide that this was going to be a bad idea? Probably, but I wanted it. Why did I want it? Because I did. When you want something bad enough, you'll do whatever it takes in order to achieve it. If you want someone bad enough, you're going to do whatever it takes to try to be with that person. If you want something bad enough, you will move heaven and earth in order to try to make it happen. It's because you have faith in yourself to make it happen. You ever wonder why a bird is never afraid of the branch that's about to break off? It's not because the bird is afraid of the branch. It's not because the bird has faith in the branch. It's because the bird has faith in his own wings. He knows if it falls, he'll fly. It's not a problem. I know that each one of you can change and do better with your life because that is something you have the power inside of you to do should you want to. It's something that resides in each and every one of us, but we have to want it. We have to desire it as badly as we desired to do the wrong thing. When it comes to being a Christian, one of the things that we have to try to identify with is, do we desire God and to be like his son as much as we want to be liked by our friends and the world? Are we willing to pay whatever price it takes in order to be moving forward with that healthier, better, wiser choice? I mean, why wouldn't you want to align with the guy who absolutely created the entire universe? He put forward rules, says, hey, if you do this, you'll be successful. What do? Ignore them. Because we don't want to take the long steps to be successful. I can't begin to tell you how many times, even in the world of real estate, I get somebody trying to sell me leads because they try to tell you this is going to be the fastest way to get wealthy. I'm coming into year 7 of my business, and my business is doing quite well, but it's been a long, slow slog, okay? This is not something that happens overnight. Business grows based on daily choices. Steps that I have to take every single day in order to continue to move my business in the right direction in order to make it successful. The same thing is true with you. You want to be successful, you have to make those choices. If we want places like Portland to do better, we have to identify for them and help them come to realize that maybe the path they're on isn't the best path, but they have to choose a different one. They have to choose not because they're being forced to choose, but because they want to choose. Well, how do you do that? How do you get somebody to change like that? How do you decide between differing moral opinions if each individual is the ultimate decision maker of what is good or bad? That's a problem for Seattle. It's a problem for Portland. It's a problem for a good portion of the world. If I'm the one who says what I think is right is what is right, by Jove, the whole world deserves a donut. That's just the way it is, because I think that's the right way to go. That's not necessarily the right way to go. It's not necessarily the right way of doing anything. Because in fact, we have to sit there and say, but hang on a minute. There's people who think that rape is okay. That's not all right. There's people who think that killing 100 Christians or killing 100 of anybody is okay because they're the infidels. They're not us. They're not like me. One of the problems that happened during the 1960s and 70s, as we tried to desegregate our society and try to integrate everybody back together, one of the biggest problems was that I heard phrases like, it's a black thing. Now, I got to tell you, there are things that are true in every culture, microculture or what have you. And there are things that I will never understand. I do not understand modern rap. You know, you give me NWA any day of the week, Ice Cube in his early days. These are people that I understand to be good rap, all right? Today's modern stuff, not so much. Kanye, I don't get. I'm sorry, dude. I don't get you. But what I do know is that in that integration, in that attempt to try to bring people together, we never stop to ask the question, well, what's unique about your culture? What do I need to understand about your culture? How can we find agreement between these two cultures? What are the things we can say that we all agree on? At the time, one of the biggest things that we said we agreed on was family. Family was important. God was important. Some of the best churches I have ever been in, the most lively, the most amazing, are black churches. A black Southern gospel church will be the most reviving experience for your soul you will ever experience. Nobody can get the Holy Spirit moving like some of those churches. It's definitely a amen, hallelujah, and praise Jesus kind of experience. They're on fire. It's amazing. I never find that in any kind of a white church. Every one of the white churches I've ever gone into is all about being prim, proper, and holding things back. We must be restrained. We must be proper. They're on fire. It's totally different. That's the kind of church I want to be a part of. I haven't found one yet up here in the Pacific Northwest, but I will. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go out and create one myself if I have to. But at this point, when we were dealing with this integration piece, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we come into a single alignment? How do we bring together an entire two cultures that have been told you must be separate for generations and bring them together? It was difficult. It was challenging. It was painful. There were growing pains associated with all of it. Watching how people react to being wronged proves that they want to recognize absolute morality. Steal from a relativist and let them be the victim of a false advertising. Watch how they respond when their spouse is relatively faithful to them versus absolutely faithful. And the reaction showcases the recognition of absolute morality. This is something that we have to sit and identify. We have to sit there and say, hey, we agree on these certain key things. It's not okay for them to come into your neighborhood and burn your house down. But that means that we also had to say that it was not okay for them to burn a federal building down. They have to be punished. They don't get to act like 3-year-olds having a dang tantrum. Science cannot tell you if it's right or wrong for you to eat your own baby's clone, but it can tell you that what you're actually doing. Then you decide for yourself you think is right or wrong. If you eat a family member or another human, you're likely to get kuru. It's a disease. One of the problems that we found early on when we were trying to beef up the beef industry was that we needed to add protein into the mix. Cows won't drink milk, all right? And no matter how much protein we feed to them, it's not going to necessarily bulk them up. We tried to do it with growth hormones and things of that nature, and we found that there was a secondary latent effect because it would show up in the milk, it would show up in the meat, and when humans consumed it, that caused secondary problems. So we said, hey, I got a great idea. Let's feed them other beef. Let's help them grow their protein by chewing on their fellow members. The diseased cattle that died on site would have been ground up and put into the feed for the cattle. They're not designed to eat meat. They're designed to eat grass. They're a herbivore. What happens as a result of all of that? They developed something called mad cow disease. It is a type of kuru. It's caused by a prion. This is a protein that's gone buck wild. All of a sudden, we saw this get transferred over into humans, and it be called Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, or CJD. The brain, as a result of being mixed and impacted and assaulted by this little prion, this little part of a protein, is so destroyed at a cellular level that the victims' brains literally turn to mush. Mush. This is not something to be proud of. So to say, oh yeah, science can tell you what the outcome will be if you do this, should have stopped people from feeding cows to cattle. It should have stopped people from feeding chickens to chickens. This sort of thing should be wrong at a really basic level, but it was a cheap way to get rid of the diseased carcasses, and it was a cheap way to try to bulk up the size and mass of the produce. You're right in speaking of the moral foundations of science, but you cannot turn around and speak of the scientific foundations of morality. One of my heroes, Albert Einstein, pointed this out because, in fact, if we continue to follow the ideas and the machinations of naturalism and its tenets, then we are going to have to embrace the idea that social Darwinism allows and said that it was okay for the Nazis to do what they did, that it's okay for groups like Boko Haram to do what they do, that it's okay to bead children. Because science says survival of the fittest. If I'm strong, I can pick on the weak. If I'm strong, I can destroy the weak. If I'm strong, I can pick the winners and the losers. Now, one of the books that came out there and tried to say, hey, look, I can answer the moral landscape using science, just created more questions than he did answers. Harris tried to redefine good to be the flourishing well-being of conscious creatures. He admits in his book that it's possible that the peak of moral landscape could be occupied by flourishing rapists, murderers, and thieves. He also admits that it's possible that goodness and creaturely well-being are not identical. Therefore, Harris's moral theory fully collapsed, but it was advocated and promoted. And one of the things you can see right there is that it was a New York Times best-selling book. We're talking about some of the same people are reading this that are still struggling with the idea that chocolate milk doesn't come from a chocolate cow, okay? Again, there are individuals who argue with science that there is a flat earth. These are not geniuses. There are some people who are incredibly intelligent just about the wrong things. So we've gone through our 4 different levels here. We've said that the universe that doesn't care about us is running in chaos. The society and culture, well, that's kind of questionable too, because depending on whose society and whose culture is going to define whether or not we feel like this is a good thing to embrace. So instead, we have to move towards the idea of what about a transcendent creator? So here's a couple of moral arguments for God, all right? Laws imply a lawgiver. There is an objective moral law. Therefore, there must be a moral lawgiver. Straightforward, simple logic, right? So if God does not exist, objective moral laws and duties do not exist. Objective moral laws and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Tautological, straightforward. We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features supervenient upon natural ones constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. There's something intuitively, something that comes from the inside of us, some little voice that speaks into our ears, something that tells us, the old cartoons from the old days, a little devil and a little angel, one side or the other, that says, don't do this. It's a bad idea. Doesn't matter if it's a pro-survival idea, it's a bad idea. Morally, it's repugnant. There's certain things that just come about that make you feel nauseous at the whole idea of engaging in that kind of behavior. One of my problems used to be with the idea of smoking marijuana was that it is what is called a morality's slippery slope. When we legalized the whole idea of smoking marijuana, it caused great angst in myself for many reasons. What I saw as the clinical director of drug and alcohol rehab was the outcome of those individuals who had decided that the moral line was here and they would step just past it. They stepped just past it when they were teenagers and they decided that it was okay to drink alcohol, even though legally they were not allowed to. But because they had already crossed that first line, because they had already crossed that first threshold, what's the big deal with smoking pot? Now they're at parties with the people that are the cool people. And because they're at the parties with the people that are the cool people, therefore it must be okay because all of their peers are doing it too. Don't you want to be one of the cool people? And what would end up happening is that it wouldn't stop with the pot. It wouldn't stop with the beer necessarily. In fact, almost always, in every single one of those cases, it would go on to harder and harder things. It would go on to cocaine. It would go on to heroin. It would go on to suddenly robbing $20 out of grandma's purse because you needed it for your drug dealer. Suddenly it became okay to sell your body in order to support your drug habit. Suddenly it became okay to sell off your child to support your drug habit. I don't say these things because they didn't happen. They did. I saw and sat across from the faces who made those choices. They crossed moral thresholds, but it all started with that first step. They didn't listen to that inner voice that said, don't do that. Stop. Wait. This is a bad choice. Instead, they moved forward with giving in to the pressure that was around them. And because they had moved forward with that one choice, it seemed okay to move forward with the other ones. So the atheist is struggling with a very specific dilemma. If there's such a thing as evil, you must assume there's such a thing as good. If you assume there's such a thing as good, you assume there's such a thing as an absolute and unchanging moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. If you assume there's no such thing as an absolute moral law, then you're basically positing that there's no moral law giver. But if there is a moral law, then you have to address the fact that there must be a moral law giver. Pretty simple. Even the atheist can agree that there are certain things that are just wrong. Lack of a better word, they'll say that it's evil. The moment they say that word, there's evil, it means that there's a counterpoint. It means that if there is darkness, then too there is light. Because again, going back to one of my previous examples, we never measure darkness. We measure how much light is in the room. So when we're measuring how much light is in the room, we're identifying, are we in the dark or are we in the light? And if so, how much light? If I turn the lights off right now, we could sit and say there's a complete absence of light. It would be totally dark in here. Some of the things that are going on in the darker parts of our society is not that they are choosing to be dark, it's just that they're not choosing to be light. It's a life without God. It's a life without a light in their life. It's a life without and can be measured a life without purpose, a life without an agreement, a shared joint agreement that they all want to choose the light over choosing darkness. If something good is because God approves it, or does God approve something because it's good? The first makes good arbitrary, the second makes good independent of God. The problem is that we're not able to identify what is good or bad without having some kind of a standard to measure it against. We have to have that singular standard. We have to have something by which we say, here's the measuring stick, and here's where it went wrong. If we have the measuring stick and we look back and almost all of the laws that we have are based on a Judeo-Christian foundation, then we have to come to an agreement that those are absolute. And behaving in any way outside of those things is wrong because they lack not just the agreement of those moral absolutes, but they lack God. The people in Portland, the people that are causing all this destruction, the people that are making some of the craziest decisions in our governments, in the effort to try to steal or cheat in any kind of a situation, in any one of these scenarios where we sit and all rise our voices up and say, that's not okay, we can't force them to do the right thing. We used to say you can't legislate evil away because you can't. People try to legislate away guns and gun violence by saying, look, we're going to make it harder to get a gun, but no criminal I ever met ever cared about the law. So what is the truth? The truth is they don't have God. What should break your heart is not that they're behaving badly, it's that the cause behind the behavior is that they don't have a savior. The cause behind the behavior is no different than some of the behaviors that individuals do based out of trauma, when their brain isn't working quite right because something happened to them that was so awful, whether on a repeated basis or an individual independent single moment, that their brain doesn't work quite right. In these kind of scenarios, their soul, their spirit, their heart doesn't work quite right. They don't have Jesus. They don't have a savior. They don't have someone or something in their life that's sitting there helping them, guide them. They don't have that wonderful counselor. As we come into the Christmas season, one of the things that I want you to look at as a part of what you're studying is the whole idea of, was there ever Jeshua ben Judah? Was there ever a Jesus? If we can show historically from outside references that there was in fact a Jesus, there was in fact this fella who got hung up on a tree, who impacted the lives of not just a few men, not just 12 individuals, but impacted the lives of thousands, nay, hundreds of thousands, no, millions of lives, even after his death. We have to investigate his claims, because then we come down to the whole idea of what C.S. Lewis put forward was he was who he said he was, or he was a lunatic, or he was a liar. If we show that he existed, if we show that his claims were so strong that people were willing to die for them, if we show that what he said was true, and we show that there was not some mass hallucination going on, then he wasn't a lunatic. He wasn't a liar. He was who he said he was, the Son of God. God is the greatest possible being. God's nature is what grounds absolute moral right and wrong. God has no obligation to anything outside of himself. He simply acts, and what he naturally does is good because it comes from his nature and his essence. Why God? Why deal with this issue now as we come into Christmas? I bring it up because we can look around the world and see that there are so many fallen individuals. People are committing crimes. People are breaking laws. Not because the laws weren't there to try to stop them, but because the enforcement isn't even happening. So the enforcement has to come from somewhere else. And that means that some outside force isn't really going to make it happen. At this point, we have to pray that the enforcement comes from somewhere inside. The enforcement comes somewhere, starting here with the healing of their heart. I want to set and say that I want to go back to my soldier days, and we would enforce the rules by just sheer brute force. It doesn't make a difference. Instead, I have to go further back to the days of being someone who worked with drug addicts, who had made a lifetime of poor choices, and would hear for the first time from people like myself and others, you don't have to make those choices anymore. You have different options. Thank you for telling me about all the mistakes you made. I'm not here to judge you. I am here to help you, give you an opportunity to make a better choice, to choose to do good from the inside out, to choose first to love, to show compassion, show respect and dignity. All the things you cry for, you have to show it first. If you want to see it given to yourself, you have to reflect it towards others. So I'm going to close with this. When we're appalled and angry about the things that we see on the nightly news, or the things that we know of from stories from friends, or some internet craziness, don't sit there and say, someone should do something. Instead, stop, pray, consider whether or not you are the someone who should do something. Because at a bare minimum, you could at least stop and pray. At a bare minimum, you could sit and pray that Jesus comes into their lives, that someone talks to them and preaches to them about Jesus, and someone who gives them hope that they can make different choices that can improve their lives, because creation doesn't come out of destruction. Creation is a unique thing all its own.